Has anyone ever told you that you were the problem, just to avoid blame?
He said it like he always does, with that half smile that feels more like a knife than a joke, the kind that is meant to land in front of everyone else, so I cannot brush it off later. Not everyone can build a career in tech, he announced, his voice carrying just enough smugness to make it clear that the line was not casual but planned. I did not even look at him. I kept focusing on serving Grandma her plate because if I had looked at him, I probably would have broken the rule I set for myself years ago, which is to never give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose control in front of family. And then it happened. Grandma set her fork down, tilted her head in that way she does when she is about to deliver something sharp but calm, and she asked the only question that mattered. Then how come your company just got bought by hers? The silence that followed was not the awkward kind you can brush away with a laugh. It was the kind that presses on your chest because no one knows where to look, no one knows what to say. And every single person realizes at the same moment that something big just shifted. I still did not look at him, because I wanted the words to hang in the air without me rushing in to soften them. For once, I let him feel what it is like when the ground disappears under your own feet. I said only one thing, that the deal had closed months ago, quietly, and that I had kept it private until I was certain the employees were protected. That was it. No bragging. No gloating. Just the truth laid flat in front of everyone. He tried to laugh at first, because laughter has always been his shield, but it caught in his throat halfway through and turned into silence again. He looked at me with disbelief, like I had pulled off some trick that should not have been possible, like maybe I had a secret benefactor or stumbled into dumb luck. Because the idea that I could have built something strong enough to buy his company with deliberate strategy was not something he could process. And then he started to stammer, asking how, asking who, demanding details that I had no intention of handing him at that table. I told him only that it was a clean deal, it kept his staff secure, it kept the clients served, and it gave him two very decent options for his own next step. Grandma placed her hand over his the way she used to when we were children, a gesture that somehow quieted him more than anything I could have said, and she looked at him with that softness that still carried steel behind it. She asked if I had told him beforehand. He admitted I had not. And she nodded and said I had told her, and she had asked me only to be kind. It was a moment that almost felt rehearsed, except of course it was not. It was simply the truth that had been waiting to come out. Our parents looked at me with a strange mix of confusion and denial, as if they could somehow spin this into a misunderstanding, as if maybe I had bought only a percentage, or maybe I was exaggerating. I gave them nothing to work with. I did not owe them a performance. I had spent the last year making sure there would be no room for their usual excuses or their habit of minimizing what I achieve. I had made sure the documents spoke louder than the noise, and documents do not care about family loyalty or holiday traditions. If you think I sat there enjoying his humiliation, you would be partly right. I did enjoy the silence that came afterward, but not because I wanted to crush him in front of everyone. I enjoyed it because for once I did not need to raise my voice, defend myself, or try to outwit him in real time. I had done all of my talking months earlier, in boardrooms and in negotiations, with contracts and retention plans, and that kind of preparation cannot be undone by smirks or side comments at a family gathering. The win was not the silence itself. The win was that the silence had been earned by months of deliberate planning that no one else in that room even knew about until that second. He finally managed to push out one word: how. He wanted to believe there was a shortcut, that maybe someone had handed it to me, that maybe it was some freak stroke of chance. I could see it in his eyes, the desperate need to explain it away in any way other than facing the reality that I had simply outmaneuvered him. I told him calmly that it was business, that it was math, that it was timelines and decisions, nothing more glamorous than that. I reminded him that there were two options on the table for him, and that whichever he chose was his decision, but shouting about it at Easter would not change the facts. What I did not say out loud, what I kept to myself, was that this moment had not started at Easter, or at Christmas when he called me a hobbyist, or at the barbecue where he introduced me to his clients as someone who worked in a nice support role. It had started much earlier, when I noticed certain numbers that did not line up, when I heard a vendor hesitate before agreeing to another extension, when I realized that the structure holding his company together was built on borrowed time. I had not gone hunting for him, but when the door opened I stepped through it, and I made sure that if I did, the employees would land safely and the work would continue. So yes, that silence at Easter was a kind of revenge, but not the screaming, dramatic kind he expected. It was revenge written in contracts and clauses, in wire transfers and retention pools, in paperwork that does not crumble under pressure. That is the part one wish people understood. You do not always need to fight fire with fire. Sometimes the most powerful move is to keep your hands steady while you write down the rules, and then watch as the game changes without you ever raising your voice. And as the plates were passed and the room tried to stitch itself back together, I knew that this was only the beginning of the conversation, not the end. Because what nobody in that dining room knew was that the Easter silence had actually begun a year earlier, when I made the first quiet move that would eventually shift everything. I called it the trap you can walk out of, because I designed it with 2 doors for him to choose, but only if he was willing to face the reality of what he had signed. And the truth is, I already knew which door he would refuse to take. The truth is that nothing about that Easter silence was accidental, because long before anyone at that table suspected a shift was even possible, I had already set things in motion quietly, step by step, making sure that each detail lined up in a way that would leave no room for denial once the truth finally surfaced. The first real move, the one that mattered, was not about lawyers or investors or some grand presentation. It was about listening to the people who usually go unnoticed, the ones who keep things running while everyone else tries to act important. Mark has always been loud about his supposed success, talking about big clients and fancy accounts, but what he never noticed was how often the foundation of his company was creaking under the weight of his ego. I paid attention, not because I was trying to catch him failing, but because I could see the way his staff struggled, the way vendors sighed when his name came up, and the way deadlines seemed to slide like water off a tilted table. I asked questions where he assumed no one would ever bother. For example, when he renewed the office lease, he bragged about locking it down like it was a trophy, but he never read the fine print, and I knew that because I casually asked his office manager during a tour he posted online. She admitted that the landlord had slipped in clauses about subleasing and purchase options in case of breach. He thought it was a nuisance, but I saw a door. I began by setting up a small entity with the most boring name imaginable, because boring names draw no gossip and trigger no suspicion. Through that entity, I opened conversations with the landlord, presenting myself as a reliable option in case things ever went south, and landlords, unlike siblings, care about rent more than family pride. I offered to cure any arrears within a week if it came to that, and in exchange, I asked for a right of first refusal on the lease. He agreed, because to him certainty mattered more than the drama Mark was constantly creating. That was my first real card on the table, and I tucked it away quietly. But I did not stop there, because I understood that the real weakness in Mark's company was not the office, it was the relationships. Vendors are the lifeblood of any business, and when they are kept waiting or given excuses, they start looking for stability elsewhere. I introduced myself to his 2 biggest vendors, not as a sister, but as someone representing potential partners interested in helping the business grow. I asked about their experiences, listened carefully, and made it clear that if they ever needed certainty, I could provide it. One of them let slip that a late payment had been quietly forgiven, something he framed as kindness, but in business, when kindness shows up too often, it usually means someone has lost patience. That single detail told me more than any balance sheet could have. I worked with a diligence team from our venture arm, keeping my name off the surface, because the last thing I needed was for Mark to hear whispers before I was ready. They looked at his numbers and confirmed what I already suspected. The company was not doomed beyond saving, but it was running on fumes, and unless someone stepped in to stabilize it, the whole thing could collapse in months. That was when I began drafting an employee retention plan that would trigger the moment we acquired. It was not about punishing him. It was about making sure his staff would not become collateral damage in his refusal to face reality. I planned retention bonuses, healthcare gap coverage, and stipends in case anyone had to relocate. If I was going to do this, I was going to do it with a safety net for everyone he never thought to protect. When people ask me whether it felt sneaky, I always answer the same way. If sneaky means dishonest, then no, because every move I made was legal and transparent to the people it needed to be transparent to. If sneaky means quiet, then yes, I was very quiet, because in our family the only way to get anything done is to keep the noise out until the work is finished. I built something Mark could not see until it was too late, and that was the only way to protect both his employees and myself. The turning point came when a vendor called me back one evening and told me that a company card had bounced on a subscription that kept their entire reporting system alive. He asked if we were still interested in a partnership because he could not afford another cycle of excuses. I wired the money the next morning, not out of generosity but because I needed the system intact if I was going to take over without disrupting operations. That wire was not just a payment, it was a signal to me that the timeline had changed, because now the company's survival was no longer measured in vague forecasts, but in days. Within 48 hours of that call, the landlord signed the side letter giving me priority if the lease came into play. And while Mark was busy posting selfies and claiming his team was crushing it, I held in my hand the documents that said otherwise. He did not know that I had secured a right to step in before he even realized he needed help. That was the difference between us. He lived in the image, while I lived in the details. I remember sitting alone the night after the landlord signed, looking at the clock and realizing that from this point on, the countdown had begun. It was not me pushing the clock forward. It was his own negligence, his own choices, his own ego. All I had done was position myself to catch what he was about to drop. And as I closed my laptop, I knew exactly what I had built. It was a trap, yes, but not the kind that locks and leaves you no way out. It was a trap with two doors, one that allowed him to walk away with dignity and another that left him clinging to his pride until it buried him. What I did not know yet was which door he would choose, but I already suspected that his ego would not let him walk through the one that could save him. I walked into his office on a Monday morning with a neutral smile and a tote bag that held two simple folders, because I had decided that the only way to keep the team safe while showing Mark exactly what accountability looks like was to present help that felt like stability rather than punishment. And I knew that if I arrived with a swarm of lawyers and a parade of titles, he would dig in out of habit and pride, while if I arrived as a potential partner with a plan that solved payroll, cleaned up vendor relationships, and left him visible paths toward dignity, he might finally stop playing the hero in his own head and pick the grown-up choice. The receptionist relaxed when I said my name, because she recognized it from a vendor email I had sent the week before to keep a critical subscription active. And that small softening in her shoulders told me everything I needed to know about the level of strain they were carrying, which is to say that people had been bracing for impact for too long and were ready for anyone, to stop the ground from moving. I asked for Mia first, not Mark, because within 5 minutes of hearing her voice on the phone earlier that month I understood that she was the person holding the actual structure together. The one who knows where the processes break and who has been triaging without praise, and when she came into the conference room with a notebook that had tabbed pages and a look that mixed caution with relief, I felt a surge of respect that made me more protective of this plan than I already was. I slid the first folder across the table and told her that it contained a bridge agreement written in plain language with 3 essential rails, which were a move of payroll to a safe custodial lane our finance team would operate for a limited period, a cap on discretionary spending that still allowed client deliveries to proceed without friction, and a conversion mechanism that would activate only if very specific and measurable triggers occurred, such as a missed payroll run or a covenant line crossing a threshold that we defined together so there would be no surprise or manipulation. I said it slowly and clearly because I wanted her to hear what I was really offering, which was time and structure and predictable rules. She read faster than most attorneys I have met, asked me for clarifications on 2 clauses, and then made a request that told me she had the team's heart wired into her spine. Because she asked me to increase the retention pool for junior staff and to formalize a healthcare gap policy that would eliminate anxiety around out-of-pocket costs during the transition period, and I said yes before she took another breath. Since those were the exact commitments I intended to fund regardless of whether Mark ever signed, as I would not build a deal that treated people like dust on a balance sheet. When she nodded and pushed the folder back, I handed her the second one, which outlined an employee communication plan that placed her at the center as the voice of continuity. Because I had no interest in putting Mark's name on a memo he had not earned, and because the team needed to see the person who actually kept them safe, which was not a founder with a loud voice, but an operator with receipts. Mark finally arrived with the kind of energy that tries to win by filling the air, shook my hand with performative warmth, called me kiddo without thinking, and sat down like a man preparing to charm his way around the facts. And I let him do his little routine for a few minutes, because I wanted him to feel heard before I put the papers in front of him. I summarized the bridge slowly, added that the triggers were not secret mousetraps but bold print with dates, and emphasized that he still controlled the story if he wanted to, since he could keep an executive presence and move into a deliverable-based consulting role for a defined runway, or take a clean exit that covered certain vendor debts and allowed him to regroup without public drama, which meant he could walk through a door and tell himself he had chosen strategy over ego, because I was offering him that out on purpose. He smiled at the word partner, skimmed more than he read, and signed while making a joke about how grown-ups hate paperwork, a joke that would have been funny if his team had not been standing on a cliff he had built, and I initialed the pages carefully, thinking about the dates lined up in my calendar and how clocks never argue. During the next 2 weeks, we quietly rerouted payroll so that every person who had been waking up with a knot in their stomach finally slept through a Thursday night. We met with each vendor and paid what was owed without grudges or lectures. And we sent clients a plain update that did not brag about acquisitions or leadership vision, but explained that service would be faster, support would be easier, and invoicing would be clearer, and the note carried Mia's name at the bottom because she had earned it, while Mark's name did not appear because the work had outgrown the noise. I also funded 2 emergency bonuses for the people who had covered impossible weekends for nearly a year, and I sent the receipts to our accounting team with the instruction to reimburse my personal outlay after closing, since I wanted it on the record that the first dollars I spent on his company went to healthcare continuity and human breathing room, not optics. When the covenant line finally tripped, it was not a surprise and it was not a disaster either, because the bridge had built a safe highway for that moment, and the conversion moved like a quiet train hitting a planned switch, with the landlord sending a crisp acknowledgement of the assignment, the asset purchase agreements activating with all the employee protections we had engineered, and the retention pool publishing amounts that people could see and count on, which is the opposite of what Mark had been offering. Before any notices went out, I called him and gave him a last chance to pick the door that preserved his dignity and cash flow, which required him to cut his own salary and freeze unnecessary travel while handing over certain dashboards to Mia. And he said cutting his salary would make him look weak even if it kept the company strong, a sentence that told me more than any spreadsheet ever could about the way he sees the world, so I thanked him for the clarity and finalized conversion. He told me he would rally the family and stop me, and I told him families do not run payroll, families do not negotiate lease assignments, and families do not keep lights on for people who just want to do their jobs. And he hung up in a haze of anger that sounded practiced rather than real. An hour later, my mother texted me a message that looked sweet but felt like a command, asking me to be a good sister and fix whatever misunderstanding had taken place, and I stared at the screen without replying, because I still had one term left to use, a term he had taught me over years of cutting me off mid-sentence and laughing when I tried to explain that leadership is not volume, and I decided that he was going to hear that term with the full weight of what it means when the person you underestimated decides to use it in a sentence you cannot rewrite. Mark has always believed that words are weapons, and for most of our lives he used them with the kind of careless confidence that comes from knowing our parents would never call him out or demand accountability, which meant that every insult, Every dismissive comment, every smug interruption at the dinner table landed without consequences. He taught me early that he valued control above honesty, appearance above substance, and noise above clarity. What he never realized, though, was that in teaching me how he operated, he was also handing me the vocabulary of his undoing, because while he thought words were tools for intimidation, I learned to treat them as terms that could be written into contracts, lined up on schedules, and deployed at the precise moment when performance gives way to paperwork. So when the bridge converted and his protests reached the family group chat, I knew the time had come to use the terms he had unknowingly taught me, not with raised voices or dramatic confrontations, but with clauses that locked down reality in ways that his personality could never override. The first term was accountability, a word he had always thrown at others without ever accepting for himself, as if responsibility were a punishment reserved for people beneath him. I decided accountability would be more than a word this time. It would be an enforceable condition. In the conversion documents, I required him to produce weekly deliverables if he wanted to keep his consulting role, specific measurable outputs tied to client work, and not the vague promises or glossy presentations he was used to coasting on. He laughed when he first saw the requirements, dismissing them as busy work, but when he realized that payment would be contingent on submission and sign-off, the laughter stopped because for the first time in his career, his paycheck was tied to proof rather than posture. He called me controlling, and I reminded him calmly that control was the exact word he had used to describe leadership for years, so if he truly believed that, then he should have no problem living under the definition he created. The second term was non-disparagement, a concept he had mocked in conversations about other deals, calling it legal muzzling. When applied to executives he wanted to ridicule. I placed it directly into his exit options, not as an afterthought, but as a centerpiece, because I knew that once reality set in, he would be tempted to lash out, to spin a story about being cheated or betrayed. And I wanted to eliminate the possibility of him using lies to damage either the employees or the clients who depended on continuity. When he protested that it was unnecessary, I asked him to recall every time he had publicly joked about me being a hobbyist or about my work being cute but not real business. And I said that if he wanted to avoid paying the price of those habits in a legal battle, then he would sign, comply, and accept that silence was now the professional option. He looked stunned that I would weaponize his own dismissiveness into a boundary, but boundaries were the only language he had ever forced me to learn. The third term was leadership, the word he abused most often, twisting it to mean authority without effort, domination without sacrifice. I redefined it in practice by appointing Mia as the operations head with full executive authority over the transition, which meant that he now reported to the woman he had ignored, dismissed, and undermined for years. Leadership in my framework meant recognizing competence and elevating it, and in doing so I gave his team the kind of leader they deserved while stripping him of the illusion that charisma could replace consistency. When he objected that it was humiliating, I asked him if it was more humiliating to report to someone competent than to bankrupt a company while pretending to be the star, and I left the silence that followed as his only answer. The revenge beat in this phase was not explosive or theatrical, but profoundly satisfying nonetheless, because it meant watching him live under the very vocabulary he had wielded so carelessly against others, a vocabulary that now bound him to performance, silence, and humility. He tried to run to our parents, hoping they would shame me into reversing course, and they did what they always do. They called, they pleaded, they scolded gently, urging me to think of family harmony, to protect his pride, to avoid embarrassing him further. I listened without interrupting, and then I told them that harmony was not a synonym for indulgence, that protecting his pride had cost too many people their stability, and that the only embarrassment left was his refusal to accept that the rules applied to him like they applied to everyone else. I did not yell, I did not justify myself beyond those words, and when they threatened to step in, I reminded them that the paperwork was already signed, filed, and executed, and that their opinions had no legal bearing on a transaction that closed weeks earlier. He sent me an email late one night filled with accusations, claiming that I had orchestrated everything just to humiliate him, that I had betrayed family, that I had poisoned our parents against him. I replied with a single paragraph explaining that the employees were paid on time, the clients were receiving better service than before, and that his two choices remained open. Fulfill his consulting deliverables with dignity or walk away with a clean exit that cleared his debts. The next morning, he chose neither, instead forwarding my email to our parents as though it were evidence of cruelty, and our father called me to say he could not believe I would treat my own brother like a hostile competitor. I reminded him quietly that Mark had always treated me as one, and that the only difference now was that the scoreboard had shifted to reflect reality. The cliffhanger, the moment that told me the final move was approaching, came when Grandma called me privately after all the noise and said that she understood why I had done what I did, that she was proud of me for protecting the staff, but that she also knew Easter was going to become a battlefield once Mark realized he could not reverse anything. She asked me what I planned to do when the confrontation arrived, and I told her I had one last move left, the one designed not for contracts or vendors or employees, but for the family itself. The move that would leave no doubt in anyone's mind about where the power actually stood. She said nothing for a long time, and then she whispered that she would be ready to speak when the moment came. That was when I knew that the silence at the Easter table was not going to be an accident. It was going to be the last door, and I was already holding the key. When Easter finally arrived, I knew before I even stepped into the house that it was not going to be just another family gathering filled with small talk and recycled stories, because Mark had been calling and texting everyone in the family for days, spinning his own narrative about how I had ambushed him, how I had manipulated him, and how I had tried to ruin him out of jealousy, and even though most of them did not fully believe his version, they were uneasy enough to prepare for confrontation. I had rehearsed every possible version of that day in my head, not because I wanted a fight, but because I wanted to make sure that when the inevitable moment came, I would not get dragged into his theater of noise. And instead, I would let the truth present itself with a weight no one could deny. What Mark did not know was that I had already involved Grandma, not to use her as a weapon, but to make sure that at least one voice at that table would not twist itself into excuses or evasions when reality finally landed. As soon as we sat down, he began with a performance that felt both desperate and rehearsed, cracking jokes at my expense, calling me the paperwork queen, and making little digs about how I cared more about contracts than people, which was ironic considering he was the one who had left his staff hanging for months, while pretending the business was thriving. I let him go on because interrupting him would have only fed his energy, and I knew the blow that was coming would be far stronger if he set himself up first. Our parents tried to smile through it, clearly hoping to steer the day toward neutrality, but their nervous glances told me they knew something was waiting beneath the surface. The younger cousins laughed uneasily at his comments, not because they found them funny, but because they had grown up trained to laugh at his jokes in order to keep peace at the table. Then he made his mistake, one he always makes when he is feeling cornered, because he went too far, too personal, and too loud. He leaned back, smirked, and said that not everyone could build a career in tech, but at least he had built something real, while I was just hiding behind numbers. Before I could respond, Grandma set her fork down with that calm precision that makes everyone freeze, and in the same even tone she has used my entire life, she asked the one question that sliced through all of his noise. Then how come your company just got bought by hers? The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the sound of forks pausing midair, you could feel the air tighten, and you could almost see the denial drain from faces that had been so quick to protect him all these years. Mark tried to laugh it off, but no sound came out, and when he looked at our parents for backup, they had no words to offer. I did not gloat, I did not lean forward, I did not raise my voice. I simply confirmed, in the same calm voice I had been practicing for months, that the deal had closed long ago, that the staff had been secured, that clients had been reassured, and that Mark had two clear choices, neither of which required humiliation if he could summon the maturity to pick one. The terms were already written, the clauses already activated, and the employees already protected, which meant nothing he shouted, argued, or begged for could change the reality of the situation. I explained, not for him but for the others in the room who were struggling to make sense of it, that it was not about crushing him or embarrassing him, but about ensuring that his team did not collapse under his refusal to adapt. I told them that the bridge had been designed with 2 doors, one where he could walk away with dignity, debts cleared and reputation intact, and another where he could stay on with defined deliverables and earn his place through work rather than noise. Both doors had been open for weeks, but he had refused to choose, because in his mind, choice itself felt like surrender. Our mother whispered that maybe we could undo it, maybe the family could sit down and find another way, and I looked at her with more sadness than anger, because it had always been her instinct to protect him from consequences, even when it meant sacrificing everyone else's stability. I told her gently but firmly that this was not a family matter anymore. It was a business reality that had already been signed, filed, and executed, and no amount of pleading would rewrite the documents. She tried to argue, but Grandma interrupted again, saying that this time there would be no rewriting, no softening, and no pretending, because she had seen enough of Mark's behavior to know that if someone did not stop enabling him, he would burn everything around him just to keep his illusion alive. Mark sat there stunned, angry, and cornered, but for the first time I saw something else in his face, recognition that he was not in control, that no matter how many people he rallied or how loud he spoke, the reality had already moved past him. He muttered that he would never forgive me, that I had betrayed him, and I answered calmly that forgiveness was not a currency I was seeking, because the employees being paid, the clients being served, and the business surviving mattered more than his pride. The table stayed quiet after that, and for once no one tried to soften the blow or make excuses, because the weight of the truth was too obvious to deny. The revenge, if you want to call it that, was never about destroying him. It was about building something that forced him to face the very terms he had mocked his entire life: accountability, responsibility, and leadership. By putting Mia in charge, by securing the staff, and by funding the retention plan, I had made sure the company would continue without him, and in doing so, I had shown that leadership is not about being the loudest voice in the room, but about making the hard decisions that others avoid. That was the last door I left for him, the chance to either step through and learn what real leadership looked like, or stay seated in his silence, pretending the door was never there. As the family tried to recover, passing plates and pretending the tension was gone, I knew that nothing would ever return to the way it had been before. But I also knew that I had achieved exactly what I set out to do. I had turned the years of mockery, dismissal, and belittlement into a plan so clean and undeniable that even his biggest defenders could not erase it. When I left the table that day, I did not feel triumphant in the dramatic sense. I felt steady, resolved, and free from the weight of proving myself to people who had never wanted to see me clearly. The silence that filled the room as I walked out was not empty. It was heavy with recognition that the rules had changed, that the power had shifted, and that I had closed the final loop of a plan that had started quietly and ended with absolute clarity. Mark might never admit it, my parents might never forgive it, and the cousins might never fully understand it, but none of that mattered, because the truth had spoken louder than the noise. I had won, not with shouting or cruelty, but with precision, patience, and a refusal to let his version of the world define mine ever again. That was the last door, and I was the only one holding the key.